Director of United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security, Dr. Xiaoming Sen, to provide her keynote address, allowing us to understand the linkages and challenges, some of the pertinent questions that Xiaoming you see when we look at social protection and when we look at climate change. Dr. Sen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It is a great pleasure for me to be here today and to convey my warm wishes to the World Risk and Adaptation Futures Summer Academy program, as well as to all its organizers, invited experts, participants, alumni, and everyone else joining us from across the globe. I myself attended one of the first summer academies as a participant. 1 year later, I organized the next 3 summer academies together with the Munich Re Foundation. I am glad to see that this program, which is very special to my heart, has thrived and been going very strong ever since. I'm so glad to see that some of the old friends, such as Thomas, Coco, Matthias, they are still around and continue to work on the topics of their passion. Indeed, climate change is the defining challenge for humanity. It is our generational quest to ensure that coming generations embrace Earth as the abode of health, peace, and well-being for all species. Our understanding of climate change risks is increasing. We are starting to understand climate risks beyond the concept of hazards and explore factors that drive vulnerability and exposure. The World Risk and Adaptation Future Summer Academy program is one such effort. The theme of this year's Academy is social protection. And over the course of the next 3 weeks and thereafter, we will collectively explore the interlinkages between climate change and social protection, including if and how social protection can be an effective tool to reduce current and future climate change risks and vice versa. Social protection aspires to protect the vulnerable strata of our society. It is in particular closely linked to the first Sustainable Development Goal, namely no poverty, especially target 1.3, which aims to implement nationally appropriate social protection systems and measures for all. And by 2030, to achieve substantial coverage of the poor and the vulnerable. In addition, it aligns closely with the second Sustainable Development Goal, zero hunger. It not only aims to reduce poverty, but also to protect people from falling back into it. However, climate change poses additional risks to our achievements. It can hamper or reverse the progress made on the poverty alleviation, while rendering more people vulnerable to falling into poverty, which can exert immense pressure on already very thinly stretched social protection programs in many countries. This raises questions on the design of successful social protection programs in the future. Our fight for climate justice is not possible without social justice. And social protection programs have empowered billions of people across the globe in this fight. However, the reach and depth in many nations remain lower than needed. At the same time, countries and communities across the world are expected to incur significant economic damage due to climate change. This calls on us to find synergies in our approaches and funding mechanisms, such as the Green Climate Fund and Disaster Risk Financing Insurance Program, and to build around each other. There are several social, economic, and political factors that cut across social protection and climate change adaptation mechanisms. There are two dominant approaches to social protection, namely growth-based and rights-based approaches. I see a clever overlap between these and IPCC climate resilient pathways. Both social protection and climate actions stand to gain from the reduction in individual vulnerabilities. At the same time, providing collective rights through institutionalized provisions can help in reducing exposure. However, we need to ensure that social protection mechanisms are adequately informed about future risks and they avoid the pitfalls of mild adaptation whilst simultaneously supporting long-term adaptation practices. One key challenge in my eyes is the incorporation of climate uncertainties in social protection mechanisms, including how to design programs that remain flexible as well as effective in order to counter climate change uncertainties. Can climate risk insurance help us in this quest? In this intertwined world, can they also help with climate mitigation? I'm raising questions, and I hope over the course of next 3 weeks and beyond, we will work together to explore these issues and share the latest scientific knowledge that can inform policy making. I look forward to learning more about this from my colleagues, our partner organizations, invited experts, and participants from across the globe. What motivates our work is our shared future and well-being. Incremental actions can only take us so far, and we need a clear change of course and a radical transformation. I very much hope that bringing social protection and climate change adaptation together can advance us further on this path. While we may not immediately start building new structures, linking social protection and climate change adaptation, the outcomes of this academy will hopefully contribute to more coherent approaches. I believe that governance at both the regional and local levels is the main key to our collective success. Both climate and social protection battles have strong local dimensions. We need to strengthen our governance apparatus and build capacities at the local level that can leverage a cross-sectional and interdisciplinary stakeholder collaboration, which in turn fosters collective action. In conclusion, social protection is used to elevate poverty, to ensure health and food security, and to ensure people can work productively even when labor markets change. Policymakers and practitioners increasingly ask about the role of social protection in helping shield people from negative consequences of weather and climate risks. There are many questions and a considerable task in front of us. But capitalizing upon our innovation and collaboration, and together, we can enhance our collective sustainability and well-being. The World Risk and Adaptation Futures Program is a testimony to our resolve to address such challenges. I would like to sincerely thank the Munich Re Foundation for their continuous trust and support. I would also like to thank MCII and LMU Munich for all their support, which contributed to making this event possible. This program is organized in coordination with the UNFCCC Secretariat, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank them for their warm support and collaboration. Most of all, I'm very thankful to all of you, our wonderful Summer Academy participants and experts from across the globe who truly make us believe in our joint endeavors. Thank you all so much, and I wish you all a very successful Summer Academy.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Shen. This was just a wonderful start we were looking for the Academy. Your questions, the point that you raised, like looking at social protection from this poverty alleviation point of view, looking at social protection, like the predominant understanding is more from employment and continuity point of view. But we in the climate field, for us, it can be a very powerful tool. And I believe our panelists of today, they would be allowing us along this journey. With this, I would like to start the introduction of our panelists. Can we have the slides, please? May I request our panelists to join us on the podium, please? Next, okay, then I hope it works. Can you go to the next slide, please? It's somehow, yeah, okay. So first of all, I would like to welcome Thomas Loster. Thomas has been a long friend of the program. He's the chairman of Munich Foundation, and Thomas has been with us, I think, since 2005, right? Since the program started. Thomas was a member of GeoRisk at Munich Re from 1988 to 2004. And he's a weather expert. He represented Munich Re Foundation at various climate change conferences at COPs. And since 2004, he is the chairman of Munich Re Foundation. Thanks a lot, Thomas, for joining us today here in Bonn in person. Next, please. Now we would like to welcome Professor Matthias Garciage. He has a chair in human geography at one of the leading German universities, LMU Munich. And Matthias has been, along with Coco, whom I would be introducing in a second, they are sort of the brains behind this current series of events. Matthias holds the chair, as I said, in human geography and heads the teaching and research unit in human environment relations at LMU. He further holds a position at honorary professor at RMIT in Melbourne. He also serves as a lead author in the IPCC's spatial report on ocean and cryosphere and the sixth assessment report, the AR6 as well. For a number of years, he has been the scientific head of the World Risk Reports as a publication that we had in the past. And we definitely look forward to, Matthias, your contribution, allowing us to understand the scientific dimensions of social protection as well as the linkages with climate change debate. Next, please. We are very happy to have among us Dr. Coco Warner. Coco has been another pillar of this academy. Coco holds the position of manager in adaptation programs at our next door neighbor, UN Climate Change at UNFCCC. She leads the Adaptation Knowledge and Vulnerability Division, and she's also IPCC lead author on climate impacts. She founded, in fact, the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative. We also have Zonke from there. So Coco, it has been a lot of like your footprints along all the programs for us. Thanks a lot for that. And she has directed research on climate migration at UN University, where she was with us till a couple of years ago. And it's always amazing to have you with us. You are ranked as top 20 women in the field of climate change debate. May we have the next slide? Yes. We are very happy to have Zonke Kraft with us. Zonke is the executive director of Munich Climate Insurance Initiative. So it's almost like, you know, a strong fraternity of experts and dedicated people who are taking this climate debate together. And yeah, so he leads the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative, which we host, UNUEHS hosts here in Bonn. He oversees activities of the organization in areas of public and private sector engagement, strategies and risk analysis, and climate insurance implementation. This is something I find fascinating, how climate insurance plays a role in all this. And I definitely look forward to learn a lot from MCI and the work, Zonke, you are doing. Thanks a lot. May we go to the next slide, please? We should have one more slide there. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, then I quickly then take chance to, yes, perfect. Thanks a lot. Aparna is a very good friend, an emerging star in the field of climate finance, and also one of our Academy ambassadors. She was with us in person in Ghana last year. And due to the circumstances this year, she is joining us digitally. Aparna works with Mercy Course. He's based in UK, and she has in past at Mercy Course, he is working in coordination with leading actors like DFID, Department for International Development, the UNFCCC, World Bank Group, and the Insur Resilience Global Partnership. She also serves as the strategic director for FET-L, if I'm pronouncing it right. It's an emerging market renewable energy finance group. And she's recognized by the World Economic Forum, as well as she has been a guest lecturer at the London School of Economics and University of Cambridge. Thanks a lot, Aparna, for joining us. We are super happy to have all of you here. So if we may start with first round of sort of like this event we are having today is kind of a tone setter. We have a couple of events coming over the next weeks. And if you ask me, frankly, I come from the urban planning background. I work at the urban and climate change dimension. How does this relate to social protection? So how does social protection relate to climate change? I think this could be the very first step. Understanding the background and I look at a couple of things that emerge very clearly. There is a lot of uncertainty, as Dr. Shane was saying, especially with the climate change and how do we incorporate that in social protection. There is a lot of complexity. There's so much of layers. There is governance, and there are different programs and funding programs. And on top of everything, we need innovation. So how do we ensure that? This could be kind of one way to look at it. And but with this, I would like to start with you, Thomas, if you don't mind. How do you see this program? How do you look at social protection as an insurance expert, as well as coming from your background at Munich Re Foundation?
Yeah, thank you, Himanshu. I'm thrilled to be here. So welcome everybody on the screen. Welcome my friends here in the room. We have some 10 friends and experts here, old friends, new friends. And we, of course, have our important partners, which Chao Meng already mentioned. It's the 15th Academy. I'm not a friend of it. I'm also an initiator. So since 15 years, we are doing this exercise. And the Academy topics usually revolve around vulnerability, about livelihood security, about climate change. And as you see, also this Academy will revolve around climate change, futures, and security. Munich Re Foundation also is hosting the world's largest conference on microinsurance, or as we say today, inclusive insurance, which is insurance to help the poor, to protect the poor and emerging poor, not only the poorest of the poor, but also those. The next event will take place in November with more than 600 experts from 80 countries. So it's really a world conference. And this is moving from country to country and is hosted from developing countries and emerging countries, from continent to continent, from Morocco, South Africa, Brasilia, Peru, Indonesia. We were in Indonesia with our World Conference, and also Bangladesh and India. So why are these countries eager to host a World Conference on insurance mechanisms? Because they know that their own social protection is very costly, very difficult, and they need partners from the private sector. So this conference explores solutions in partnerships of private sectors, insurance industry, and of course the needs of people and the needs of governments. So that's why these countries are so eager to host the conference. And I just recall, and Coco was with me in Colombia in 2009, President Uribe gave a 40-minute speech on this conference, addressing that core of a healthy developing country is a healthy family, which is being protected. And he fully understood that not only the country itself can manage it, he needs partnerships. He maybe needs even the private sector to go in partnership to serve the people. So here is the first thing, that we need to be partners, and the academy participants, they are not only scientists, they are decision makers, they are practitioners, and I'm very happy to be here in this round of distinguished experts for the next weeks. So when we look what we see in the world today, Corona, everybody speaks about Corona, and this will of course also influence the debate about protection, about social protection. What is if the breadwinner is dying due to Corona? So the debate will be ongoing in families, in communities up to the upper level of the state. And when we look at the private sector world, they also are looking for new solutions. They know that the traditional models maybe fade out over the next future. We have a new environment, we have digitalization, we have mobile money. So the insurance world is looking for new ways, for new insurance patterns, also for new solutions. And then number three, we have new kids on the block, young agile scientists, decision makers who want to create a better world, who put up startups serving, who bring a number of ideas. So we have a vibrant world now, and we have an open private sector to interact with these young, wild, in a positive way, people who are so bright and have so good ideas. So this is setting, as we have it today, a very positive environment for fostering and moving social protection forward. Now let me come to a point of science. Of course, it's an academy, so we have scientists and we have key scientists. LMU is one partner, University of Excellency. And we will have a number of scientists in our cohort of participants. So why do we need science? On the one hand side, we have a so-called academic track. Science must prove that our engagement, that our solutions are working. They need to use scientific methods to show that our solutions are really sustainable and are working. And they need to tell us about data and about the future. And this is what the academy is all about. Looking to the future, how climate change will affect our country's demographic growth, demographic development, and our not only environment, but also our cultural environment and our regulatory environment. So this is an extremely important academy, and I'm so happy to have so great scientists, so great participants, so great decision makers and policy makers in our arena. So let me again thank you. Of course, UNU EHS, Xiaomeng, this is an ongoing partnership since 15 years, and just recently UNFCCC joined us, Coco, as a representative. Thank you to the UNFCCC. We love to work together to create new thoughts and not forget our partners in Indonesia, Bapenas or GIZ in Indonesia, who will be one cornerstone, one important partner, because Indonesia will be a key country which we are serving. So good luck to the Academy, and I would like to give the word back to Himanshu.
Thanks a lot, Thomas. This was definitely very encouraging. And at the same time, you provide a very strong foundation to the debate. I think the collaboration that you pointed to, the role of private actors, the role of like sitting in any particular actor constellation, we have to have the larger overview, and climate debate and the climate fight is a fight for all of us, not just one particular sector, not just one actor. So thanks a lot for that. And that provides me the perfect opportunity to bring in Matthias. Matthias, would you like to share from the academic perspective? Definitely you can bring in all other perspectives as well. How do and where do we stand in terms of the state of art, if we may look at the climate change as well as social protection? And if you see any particular challenge that you emerging, something that really catches your eyes. Matthias, floors are yours.
Right, yeah. Thanks, Himanshu. And hello to everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending from where you're logging in. I can see by the names of the attendees, we have, I think, now over 100 attendees, and judging just by the names, knowing some of you, many of you actually, but not all of you, that we have a good representation and a good buy-in from different parts of the world. So hello to everybody. It's a great pleasure to spend the next 3 weeks with you. Now, what I quickly want to talk about is, Himanshu, you already mentioned it. We have been working together for a long time. So we have simple maybe, but also similar minds. So I want to talk about why I think that issue is relevant. I look forward in the next weeks also to talk about what we know from a scientific point of view, and maybe also what we don't know, and how we need to work together to create the knowledge that we need in order then with the partners to do the action that we need. Now, in my research, which is on, research is all about knowledge creation, hopefully policy relevant knowledge and actionable knowledge. I really like to look into future trends of risk. And in particular, I'm a climate modeler. I like to look into future trends of vulnerability and future trends of human exposure. And I've been doing that with my groups in Bonn and also here in Munich for a while. And even though I like looking into the future and assessing what risk might look like in 10, 20, 50 years from now, I'm very much grounded in sort of 40 years of readings, of literature, core readings on vulnerability. And I think it's sometimes interesting also for this academy to remember what some of those core messages are, which are not new, which have been around for many years, but which we tend to forget from time to time. First thing is, if you think about vulnerability, social vulnerability, your yardstick needs to be the most vulnerable, not so much the averages across systems or average values. It's the most vulnerable. And can, for example, a social protection measure help the most vulnerable to get out of their vulnerable situation? That can be the poorest, that can mean other things. So that is, I think, very important, and we've been trying to work on that. Secondly, extreme events and disasters are not part of the non-normal. They're part of the normal. And still too often, maybe COVID is an example of that, we tend to frame all of these issues as something that are surprises. We didn't know that was coming. We didn't prepare for that. That is part of our normal world. And that, I think, is sort of a backdrop against which we need to speak. And thirdly, what are disasters? Disasters can be defined in many different ways. One of those key ways is actually, where are people pushed beyond their own capacity to cope with the situation? Where do they need external assistance, support, an insurance mechanism, and so forth? And so when thinking about these things over the past years, about these three things, I increasingly came to realize, how can you talk about these things without talking about social protection? And that seems so obvious, but at the same time, in our vulnerability literature, actually social protection, if you look also into the work of IPCC and so forth, doesn't feature very prominently, not very explicitly at least. These are still very separated communities. And I think this academy, if we were to bridge a little bit between these communities, that was, I think, really great. What interests me in particular in these things, so it's the question, social protection, does it work? Does it work for whom? Who needs to be heard in designing these things? And secondly, will social protection change in the future, and the role of social protection to actually, lessen the vulnerability of those most vulnerable? And so over the next couple of weeks, I look forward, really, I think we have a very rich program. And I would just like to highlight a couple of things I'm particularly looking forward to and which I think are very relevant. We will be looking into our pool of knowledge. What do we actually know about social protection? What are past developments and what can we learn for the future? It's quite striking to see that in some parts of the world, countries have a coverage of only 30–40% of those people that they aim to capture and to cover with social protection, but only 20%, in some cases 30–40% are actually captured. So why is that? Do we understand what the barriers are and so forth? Do we understand what the future trends hence can be, and how they also relate to certain demographic changes, to economic changes? Who actually needs social protection in 10, 20, 30 years from now? And hence that academy very much relates to the themes of the two previous years, which were in demographic change and on urbanization. Do we actually know what would be the need for social protection in 20 years from now in a highly dynamic context like Indonesia? Very important. Do we have the right scientific methods to assess these things? I think that is very important. So in other words, we need to characterize the problem more clearly, and that is always one of our aims in science, to characterize the problem, to understand the problem more clearly. But secondly, and that is increasingly important also in the work of IPCC, in the work to create knowledge for policymakers, we need to also create knowledge on what we call the solution space. Do we actually know what works and what doesn't work in order to work on those problems? And that is maybe even the more exciting thing for the moment, at least the more open thing. So we have more knowledge gaps in those. And I would just, to close off here and to give us a little bit of an appetizer into some of the events of the next week, I would just like to highlight three things which I think are particularly relevant. Oftentimes we talk about the effectiveness of social protection, and Thomas highlighted that for very right reason. Does it work? Is it working? Is it effective? And so forth. And we have emerging studies that assess that, and we'll be hearing a lot about these. But certain things, when looking into the future, still tend to be forgotten, even at the conceptual level currently. First of all, how do actually normative visions and the underlying ethics of social protection change? Do we actually know what sort of social contracts societies have for developing a safety net for the most vulnerable, for the poorest? And is that changing in many parts of the world? And will that change in the future? Very exciting, very relevant questions. Without these bottom layer or base layer, I think you don't even need to talk about effectiveness and about actual tools. Secondly, what is the role of the state in all of that? The role of the state is shifting and shaping in tremendous ways in many parts of the world. Do we actually know, when building social protection, we assume that the state has a strong role to play? Is that normatively so? Is that right so? In some parts of the world, it seems that people no longer wait for the state. Civil society is coming in, microinsurance schemes are coming in, and so forth. Does that mean we give up on the state? What is the role of the state and all of that? Very important question, I think, and it would be interesting and exciting to talk about this. But then also, thirdly, if you look into social protection literature, oftentimes it's actually reduced to the welfare state. But there's a huge social protection mechanism in the informal realm that is going on in many contexts of the world. And what is the role of that? And is that changing in a very dichotomous world that we will be facing in the future? And we'll be hearing interesting talks with some PhD students about informal social protection. I think that will be interesting to also capture. So it's more of these underlying things. It's about the social contracts in societies that I think we also need to address as a base layer for the entire discussion. I very much look forward to bring that into the discussion here and there. So I'd shut up here, Himanshu, for a moment, but I'm very much looking forward to the next 3 or 2 weeks. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Matthias. That was definitely very, very interesting. At the same time, very provocative in terms of what you proposed. How do we look at the programs? Not simply designing it, but looking beyond that. What matters or who needs to be protected? And it's so fascinating that almost all the debates we start with, we come down to these questions of moralities, values, social norms. And as a society, we need to answer these questions so that our reach is to all the, it reaches all the people who need it. With this, I would like to pick on one particular point that Matthias mentioned, was basically taking it to actions. How does it really matter on the field? We have a sort of like wealth of knowledge, we have experts, but how does it look at the ground level, and how any particular scheme, maybe it's climate insurance or the work, especially what MCI does, how do you relate this to social protection? And again, the same question goes to you. What would you see as the key challenges, if you can name maybe 1 or 2 of them? So Zonke, now the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. And good to see so many faces, familiar ones and unfamiliar ones. So I'm Zonke Kraft. I lead the MCI. And obviously, there are many intersection of our work to the topic of social protection. So first, on a personal note, I have to say I'm super excited that the organizers chose the topic this year. Actually, if you look at the SDGs, the biggest 2 problems of the world, one, climate change, the other one, increasing inequalities and rising disparities in societies. Both of them are actually combined in this topic of social protection. So it's a very relevant discussion to have. And I'm happy that we can actually pull this group of people together to explore also some of the future dynamics behind the debate. So thank you very much, and more on a personal level. From an institutional perspective, I'm coming already at a later stage in the presentation. So a lot has been said by the framing intervention, by Xiaoming, by you, Thomas, and Himanshu as well. So MCI is a think tank. We are looking at insurance-linked solutions for the poorest and the vulnerable people in developing countries. And for some people, this is an oxymoronic definition. It is difficult to imagine a person that doesn't have any financial means to actually pay for an insurance mechanism. And then you're already in the space of social protection approaches. So it's our very work that is actually anchored in the topic of social protection. In terms of some of the activities we are doing, we work with government agencies and government actors. We work with public sector development actors. We also work on climate risk analytics, and we work on concrete implementation. So for example, we are helping facilitate weather-related insurance approaches in Caribbean states. And we have been in the markets and also help to that these kind of markets can be created. So there's a lot of portfolio, and many, as I said, many points relate to the social protection agenda. Just a few things I want to highlight, and I also acknowledge we will have a debate afterwards, so I don't want to take all of the points at this stage. But some of the questions we have to ask ourselves is also what are, and it relates to things that Matthias, that you said. What are the different responsibilities? The responsibilities of the government, the responsibilities of the private sector, the responsibility also on the individual. It is also clear that there are different objectives. For example, a social protection approach, which is, for example, linked in a rights-based approach, is not the same thing as asking for, say, for example, risk-based premiums on some of your activities. So we have like kind of conflictive values here, and we have to see of how to best balance that. So how can we actually create a link between a protection approach and also risk reduction in the first place? And I think these are all questions that we have to ask ourselves also in the context of looking closer between climate change and social protection moving forward. Then also, and I'm happy to discuss this later as part of the panel. I do think, I agree with you, Matthias, it's looking at the most vulnerable. But I think we also need to have like a bigger approach, which also makes sure that the individual is capacitated to take care for himself or herself. And I think it's also part of the package. So in a way, we need to have an ecosystem around different approaches. And I think that's why also insurance, private insurance, social insurance, basic social protection, things like that are always thought together or need to be discussed together. And then the latest point, or the last point I want to say is, in this space, of course, we might also see rent-seeking behavior. We might need to discuss safeguards for that. We are asking also for kind of public intervention, and they need to have the best value. So I think this is also important to mention, that out of this debate, we should actually develop the right safeguards.
Thanks a lot, Zunke. Definitely this question of safeguards, and if I may add to that, maladaptations. How do we avoid these pitfalls? I think that would be very, very necessary as we go forward on this path. I also would like to maybe, if the time permits, know a bit more about the climate insurance programs you talked about and how is it unfolding. Let's see where the debate leads to us. I already am getting certain ideas, and we will in 10 minutes or 15 minutes, we will start with that. You as panelists, you are also free to have certain questions if you wish. We will have hopefully some time, and because that's what we would love to do. We have a set of actors from different walks of life, and together we can get the best out of it. With this, I would like to go into the very detail, and especially the work that Aparna, you are doing. I find it's just mind-boggling, at the same time a bit complex to understand. So climate finance, I mean, money matters, and it does, especially when lives are at stake. So how do you see the role of social protection? And first of all, that how climate finance, the work that you do, how do you relate it to the larger thematic debate that we are having? But feel free to deviate. Feel free to bring in any other perspective you like. So Aparna, floor is yours.
Perfect. Thanks, Himanshu, and thanks to the whole Academy team. It's really exciting to have all of us together here. I think in terms of social protection, it absolutely relates quite directly to the work in the climate finance space. Because ultimately, when we're looking at financing mechanisms and really trying to operationalize what we're talking about in terms of social protection mechanisms, the actual instruments that we have are specifically basically overlap quite significantly with instruments that exist for climate finance and specifically climate change adaptation measures. And so, you know, there's been some discussion around whose responsibility it is to pay for these mechanisms. But if we do consider the lens of social protection being a responsibility of the state to finance, the mechanisms that exist to finance these measures overlap almost entirely with climate and disaster risk finance tools. For example, you know, ranging all the way from reserve funds for smaller disasters, working up to contingency credit lines, for example, the catastrophe, the CAT DDO that the World Bank offers, regional risk pools, all the way to, you know, the private market and reinsurance and insurance opportunities, as we heard from Thomas as well. And so in terms of the mechanisms, I think there's quite a bit of overlap so far. And to move that forward with regards to, kind of innovative financing models for social protection, that's an area that really does require a little bit more focus, because at least as far as I'm aware, there's only one innovative finance tool outside of these mechanisms that I've just listed that has been issued. So this was in Colombia about 2 years ago, a workforce development social impact bond that was specifically in partnership with the local Ministry for Social Protection to basically help increase the employment as labor markets are shifting towards new industries and new norms. But in terms of financing mechanisms that are kind of outside of this realm and outside of the standard offerings of disaster risk finance, I think there's definitely more opportunities to figure out how to operationalize some of these issues that we're talking about. But in terms of kind of key gaps and questions, I'd like to, I guess, propose maybe a few. I'd like to introduce some more tangible questions as well. So one specifically, I think, is one issue that's quite interesting to look at right now is the state of remittances, right? So at the household level, remittances are a key contributor to social protection. They're not state funded, but they're quite significant at a household level. And now if we look at this from the lens of what the COVID pandemic is doing, the World Bank is projecting a 20% decrease in remittances worldwide. Now, this is significant for a lot of reasons, but specifically when you have, when you consider the fact that remittances eclipse overseas development assistance more broadly, and in some countries, for example, in Haiti and in Nepal, remittances make up between 30 and 40% of the GDP in terms of what they account for. So this reduction that of 20% that COVID is resulting in is really quite significant from the lens of social protection, of course, but I think drawing parallels to what the pandemic means and the types of shocks and stresses that climate change inevitably will also be introducing to our economic systems. I think it's really quite important for us to really come to terms with the gaps that are being that we are already seeing in issues like remittance flows. I think the second issue that could be quite interesting to explore is specifically looking at how we can quantify the benefits. Forgive me, I think I'm always quite interested in looking at how we can speak about these matters in more financial terms. But, for example, the DRR and resilience community, though there is a lot of work to be done, I think there's a lot of really good work that's gone into creating a very tangible line of logic that's backed by evidence that shows that investment in DRR and resilience directly decreases the amount of investment that's required in humanitarian assistance post-disaster. And so I think if we could focus, as a community looking at the research that's needed to make a strong case for why investments in social protection also make a lot of sense in the long run, kind of tying it into poverty alleviation, tying it into a lot of these topics that other panelists have spoken on today, I think are really quite interesting. So I'll pause there and give it back to Himanshu, but it's really quite an engaging conversation so far.
Thanks a lot, Aparna. It's just amazing to see your enthusiasm about the work you do. It makes us believe and also understand these complex topics. And I particularly liked your angle of sort of interlinking DRR, social protection, and climate change, because that allows me to do a bit of advertisement for the next week, where we sort of look at this intersection from the adaptive social protection perspective, and we explore a bit like cases from Indonesia. But thanks a lot. There are so many questions that I guess we can go on for hours. But before that, we intentionally have kept the policy angle in the end, because policy matters. We are in the UN setup. How the global climate change debate, if we look at the role, for example, Coco, your organization is having UNFCCC. How do you see it from the policy-making perspective, the role of social protection? And you are also IPCC author, so science, action, everything together. A lot of responsibility on the last
Thank you. And it's been a wonderful start. It's terrific to be here and to hear friends as well as colleagues. It's been really inspiring so far and exciting. I'm going to go back to Thomas, where you started, and that is what we're all doing here. But I'm going to broaden it out just a little bit. In any given week, if you think about your daily routine, the people that you interact with, what you care about, you'll come to a few basic things. And although we're spread out all over the world, throughout time zones, as you pointed out, Matthias, and continents, different cultures and languages, the human experience unites us. We are, depending on who we are and where we are in our lives, raising and feeding children. They're always hungry. We're educating ourselves. We're pursuing careers and livelihoods. We're taking care of parents, and we're all trying to stay healthy. And as we near the close of our lives, we are trying to ensure a dignified closing of life for ourselves and the people that we care about. That's the human experience. And together, individually, as an expert community, and also in the realm of policy, we face some very significant challenges. These disruptions that we have ahead of us, whether it's COVID-19 or on a larger scale, climate change, these disruptions are pulling us into the future, and there's a lot of uncertainty. Climate change imposes disruptions on a new time scale, and for sure a different spatial scale than we know in our human experience. This really requires us to rethink, what does that mean for me in my life cycle? What does it mean for me trying to get my kids to school or trying to pursue a career? I'll come back to that. We also face some problems in our systems, our social protection, where it exists, whether it's formal or informal. Matthias, you touched upon that, is really geared towards needs of the past. And our social protection systems, whatever they look like, are addressing needs that have come up in the past. And yet the disruptions that we're facing are evolving at such a scale and such a pace that we're being catapulted into the future without necessarily knowing, as a policy community, what needs to be done to be prepared for those risks that are coming. And then again, to bring it to maybe almost a philosophical and very personal level, what does these disruptions mean for me, for you, for us in our lives? Last night at dinner, talking with friends, I mentioned I was at the principal's office yesterday morning talking about, my children's school experience, their kids now, and COVID will be over in a few years, God willing. But their childhood is only now. And individuals need to get through today. We need, in the next 5 years, we've got to figure out, how do we put food on the table for people who face an extended drought? That affects many years of their lives, and they need help not only now, but over periods of time. So it's not a philosophical, it's really a very practical thing, and policy is struggling to address these challenges. UNFCCC understands climate change, and we're the authoritative convener of all countries who are members of or parties to the UNFCCC as a convention. And I wanted just to share with you, if Himanshu, if you could just point me in the direction, I just wanted to share with you 3 foundations.
Yeah, just give me a second. Dom, can we have the slides up, please?
And I'm going to just show you the basis. For us, the basis is always the decisions that countries come together and make at the climate negotiations. So the first, we'll take it all the way back to 1992 when the convention was created. And this is the objective. This is Article 2. And I'm just going to focus on the parts highlighted in blue. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you on a time journey from 1992 all the way up until almost the present to give you an idea. And actually, we're coming to you as an expert community. What role could social protection play in helping all of us manage the risks and impacts of climate change? So first of all, the objective of the convention is to to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic climate change. And these are three things that that level would reflect. One, that is all achieved in a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally. So there's a time element. And there's also an agent of nature. Often in social protection, we don't think of ecosystems, but maybe we need to. Second, to ensure that food production is not threatened. Third, to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. So that's the purpose of climate change, of climate change policy. Next, now I'm going to fast forward us to the Paris Agreement. Thank you, Himanshu. And the Paris Agreement also has an Article 2. And the article here is to take into account and to really strive towards that overall objective that I just explained to you, and to strengthen the global response. This is this first area in blue in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. So that sets the whole context of what climate policy and the Paris Agreement are about. And here I'd just like to focus on one of these sub-elements of the objective of the Paris Agreement, and that is to increase the ability to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change and foster climate resilience. And then we can go on. The reason why I wanted to point out this subparagraph is that we start setting some kind of almost like parameters for how society could move forward. We need to make sure that nature is taken into account, that food production isn't interrupted, that people have a chance for development, that we eradicate poverty. And you see here that our highest aspirations are intimately entwined with how we manage and address climate change. And the last basis that I wanted to show you came from a decision at COP23 that was held here under the Fiji presidency here in Bonn a few years back. And this is where social protection can play a role. And there are probably many other roles, but this is where social protection shows up in our mandated decisions. So this is at the beginning of a decision. You see the footnote at the bottom. And countries are really concerned about the increasing frequency of extreme events and slow onset events. Countries have recognized an urgent need to avert, minimize, and address these adverse impacts. And so they really see the need to manage these risks. And that is where social protection appears in a UNFCCC mandate. And so maybe just to draw this to a close, we have an enormous challenge ahead of us. We've come to you as an academy, as a cohort of experts and colleagues to ask you these questions. What role can social protection play in helping vulnerable people avert, minimize, and address a range of adverse impacts? And how do we do that in a way that will really pull us into a resilient future and give everyone something to look forward to? So a lot of questions, and it's a privilege to be here. I look forward to learning from you all. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I mean, having more questions definitely helps, but what we don't have more of is time. That always happens. But the questions you are raising, the questions we are raising as a panel, as a group, are very, very interesting, at the same very pertinent. We have to understand like one question, if I can draw out of all the questions that I did not, to be true, right in the beginning, was who needs to be protected. Like that's the very fundamental question. And I think that is something we would come to you in the end. So that would be your concluding remark. You have now time to prepare for it. So from your perspective, from your point of view, and at the same time, I would also like to now invite all our participants to post their questions. And like, it's such an immersing debate that I'm sort of losing track of what I need to say, what I did not, because I missed some announcement, and that reminds me about the questions. So yes, please feel free to post your questions in the question and answer box. If you would like to address them to a particular panelist, please indicate that as well. We are also a bit in the fix when we were trying to fix the time zone, because we had requests and in the past association from across the world. And we know some of our friends and colleagues are joining from the US West Coast. For them, it's almost like very early in the morning, if I would say, and from Latin America. So really sorry for that. We are also live streaming this event on Facebook, and we would be making this event available also as a recording on Facebook and later on other social media channels. So these are some logistic information, but at the same time, and now what I would like to do is, based on the questions we have heard, I would like to now club them and ask to you in pairs. For example, I wanted to understand, for example, the role social protection is playing in IPCC debates. So we are really happy to have you and Matthias. So Coco, you and Matthias, you both are associated with IPCC. If we look forward to the sixth assessment cycle, do you think social protection is being addressed from the scientific point of view and with the correlation? Or what sort of scope, if it is still there, of incorporating social protection? Simply looking at what the work IPCC is doing, the latest scientific understanding of climate change. So first, maybe we go to Matthias, and then we quickly come back to Coco. Matthias, sorry, you are muted.
That is correct. Yeah. Okay. Sorry for that. One would think that you are now so zoomed in that this doesn't happen anymore, but it has. Anyway, thanks so much. A very, very important question. And I think Coco also has a lot to say about this. I mean, IPCC can only work with what is there in the literature. I think the core task is obviously to assess the state of knowledge, primarily in the published academic literature, increasingly also in grey literature. And so what we see in the literature is I think, this interesting tension, which I alluded to already earlier, but maybe to make it more explicit, and that is that social protection is so central to climate change, vulnerability, resilience, transformation, adaptation, whatever you want to call it, all of these failures. And it's in a lot of the assessments, a lot of these studies that we have, but it's not being made very explicit. What's quite interesting is you wouldn't have, at least to my knowledge, for instance, in academia, working groups under the label, not many at least, under the label of social protection and climate change vulnerability, or a chair professorship somewhere in that field, social protection and climate change vulnerability, to really tease out these linkages. And that is, I think, what we need to bring to the fore. That is what's making our life a little bit difficult in the assessment, because we have to look for a lot of the hidden signals in the literature if we want to really bring social protection to the fore into a more explicit assessment, which I think we have been given the task also by recent developments in the policy space, and Coco has alluded to that. So I think that's what we're being left with. But let me maybe just allude to one point. I think it's also a mistake to just look for the climate change debate, and that's maybe the biggest mistake that we shouldn't be doing in the social protection realm. If climate change becomes an incubator, an accelerator for social protection debates, that's very nice. But let's not forget, actually, social protection is already being debated in the policy space and also in academia outside of the climate change context for a long time. And this is something we have to tap also for the next 2 or 3 weeks here. And this also needs to be happening and increasingly being happening. We shouldn't, I think, fall into the trap of saying now social protection finally becomes relevant just because of the climate change thing. Climate change adds to the challenges to which social protection can be a response, but it's by far not the only challenge. And so I think that is something that we have to keep in mind. So what does that mean for all of us? I think over the next 2 weeks, let's also learn, let's also listen to the voices that have been working with social protection, but maybe not from a climate perspective, but maybe from other perspectives. And there's a lot of rich knowledge and expertise in the field. Let's also not communicate to the policy world that this is only a climate change adaptation mechanism. I think the co-benefits are the thing. It's really one of these prime examples of a no-regret adaptation strategy. Investing into social protection will be very beneficial for climate risk reduction. But even if climate risks were not to happen as greatly as we expect them to happen, it's still a very good thing to do for many other reasons. And I think that's the interesting thing here in tapping these different knowledge bodies then. And that's challenging for us in the IPCC because we typically look into climate change related literature, whereas there might be a huge hidden back end that we also need to consider.
Coco, would you like to add something?
Yeah, just it's perfect what Matthias said, and I would add 1.5 points. The half point, because Matthias, you've already said it so well. When it comes to IPCC, it's a literature assessment, which means that those involved in research, that's a very call strong to action. Please bring your best available science, publish it in peer-reviewed articles, be strategic and get the right keywords in your article so that lead authors like Matthias can pick it up when they're reviewing the literature. It's absolutely critical that all of you who we're learning from really bring the best available science and publish it. On the policy side, so that was the half, adding on to Matthias. And the other point is the UNFCCC policy process has a very strong science policy interface. And I know that one best because it's my day job. There may be other policy processes. But if you are interested in bringing your best available science, knowledge, or good practice to policy, then there's also an open invitation to get involved. We have an Adaptation Knowledge Hub where we will put up your case studies and disseminate your information and your knowledge. There are so many knowledge gaps. Obviously, social protection is a big field where there are lots of gaps that you can help fill. So that's called the Nairobi Work Program. There's also a research policy dialogue where research and scientists come on a regular basis and make presentations and hear questions from policymakers, get involved in that. Coming up, there are two really big processes. There's a periodic review. Again, that is a long-standing science to policy dialogue. And then, of course, you've probably heard of the global stock take. All four of those elements are adaptation knowledge, or just all kinds of knowledge that help policymakers understand better the risks of climate change, as well as a whole variety of risks. I'm just talking about climate change because that's where I work. And then possible ways to deal with those risks in ways that really help protect vulnerable people.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. So before I move to the next question, I thank both you, Matthias and Coco, for providing so many PhD topics to people who are listening in. I mean, these are really interesting questions, and it always helps if our work is so much needed. This motivation is very much needed. So thanks a lot. Now the time, like clock is really ticking fast. I go to the next question and then we open up the floor for questions. We are already getting some on the screen, so please have a look, take your peek. Matthias, we would also coordinate with you and Aparna regarding the questions. But before that, I would like to ask Thomas, you and Zonke together, because I think Zonke, you said in your address that if you look at the social protection mechanism, it's very centralized, at least the way I understand it now, in terms of policy formulation. But so quite often they are like nationally owned and they rely significantly on multilateral and bilateral donations and so on. But at the same time, this local dimension matters a lot. So how do we look forward to a social protection, or what sort of social protection do you see could be a bit more decentralized, be it more flexible, can include a bit of uncertainty, the way we talked about. So making the system more flexible and more decentralized. Would that be possible? Or if something on that sort is already happening? So maybe we start with Zonke, maybe we start with Thomas. Okay, you two decide.
Okay, well, I mean, I can have a start and then maybe you jump in. So actually, I think that's also the reason why I advocated in the first bit to have a broader view on it. I do think it needs to be an ecosystem of approaches. The central government for sure does have also a central role. But it's clear that there are limits to these mechanisms. It is clear we heard about, for example, remittances as an individual measure, and they have such a large role to play, so they are clearly part of the picture. Also, the private sector needs to take up some of the responsibility or some of the protection. I also already do see one question to this extent also in the chat, but it's clear there's only if you look at a centralized instrument, it will hit its limits. And for example, individuals themselves need to do to their best abilities, need to prepare for themselves as well. So I think this is important. So my advocacy call is, let's look at it from an ecosystem perspective. Yes, really, governments have a central role to play. Government instruments have a central role to play, but we also have to discuss the formal and the informal. We have to discuss insurance approaches, and also one thing to say: an insurance in itself is not a private sector activity alone. It needs to be regulated. So it is actually an activity that is, in a way, initiated also by governments and stakeholder groups, and especially on the topic we are talking about, social insurance specifically, but also climate risk insurance. You realize that you actually need a lot of actors to basically implement it. The insurance capacity is only one part of the equation. It doesn't make sense to implement a product which doesn't necessarily have an impact on say the risk side. So you need to combine it also with disaster risk reduction measures or climate change adaptation measures. Insurance is usually only taken out for, like, say, 1 year. But we know climate change is a long-term process, and these kind of instruments need to be relevant over time. So all I'm saying is, at this level, at this aggregation level, I can say is we really need to have a broader view on it to conceptualize the topic and the intersection of the different topics.
Yeah, and let me add, I mean, speaking for the private sector, why involve the private sector? Because he simply knows how to do it. They are managing assets, pension funds, everything with high efficiency. They need to be highly efficient because they are private sector. And of course, they have lean processes. They strive for lean processes, and they are free of political will. If you only give it to the government alone, and then the election period is coming, there might be political will in decisions in serving other voters more than others or so. And then we have a question here from the auditory, from Nora. She said, we cannot, what happens if the private sector takes over social protection in a country? This can really be a problem, and they are striving for money. So Nora and everybody, two answers to this. On the one hand side, not every private sector is only striving for money once it comes to this question. I met insurers in the Caribbean, for example. I said, why do you do it pro bono in Jamaica? Because I have to serve my country. It's my country, and I, of course, want to make money, but I need to serve my country. And this is true if you only look at the Insurance Development Forum, an initiative which serves development. All leading insurers are a part, and they hardly make money out of it, but they bring in their expertise. And secondly, and also back to Nora and all, of course, it's an issue of how to put the agreement between the government and the private sector. Once donor money is involved, which Sönke said, there is, of course, a highly disclosed process. Everybody looks where the money goes to, because the donor would never allow that the private sector is enriching himself through donor money or so. So it's a question of the agreement that's being made. And of course, the leading institution must be the government, and use the private sector partner as an impulse giver, as a knowledge provider, how to get it right.
Thanks a lot, Thomas. I definitely, looking at the question one that you already have addressed, so thanks a lot for that. The regulations that you're talking about, the bilateral understandings that you're talking about, they all point to the same direction, that we need all the actors together. The government has to know what the private sector is here for. From the civil society, there has to be awareness as well as demand coming out, because the process needs very radical, very transformative actions, as Xiaoming has pointed. Business as usual would not take us there. So all actors together. With this, I very quickly I would go to Aparna for you, understanding if you can build upon what Zonke and Thomas talked about, but more from the microfinance perspective. Would you like to share something there? The role of looking beyond, the not that much regulated, but more at the ground level activities. How do you see that unfolding?
Thanks so much. Yes, I think microfinance is. I hesitate to say that it could be, an ideal solution, because ultimately, I think it can be a part of a portfolio of options that's available. But ultimately, for communities, for poorer households and poorer individuals that can't afford the premiums, I think microfinance itself, also in terms of savings cooperatives and other kind of forms that it can take, I think it's a good option to keep on the table, but it has to be something that's implemented in conjunction with other solutions as well. Yeah.
No, perfect. That was very much to the point, because that brings us to the next set of questions. And maybe we try to do that in 10 minutes, and then we come definitely to the last concluding remarks in 1 minute. Who needs to be protected? That is in fact one of the questions. Maybe we start with question number 4 that we have on our screen here. So I would read it aloud for Matthias and Aparna. Could one of the panelists give example of countries or case studies where social protection instruments have been used for climate adaptation? Just to answer that a bit, definitely tune in for our next event, because we would be looking into that more from the Indonesia perspective. But would someone like to share something very quickly there? Or we keep it for the next event? Coco? Yes.
I think many countries you can find examples where many countries will have weather-related elements in all kinds of aspects of social protection. But I would like to challenge the question, not the question actually, but how we think about it. Because my first response when reading this excellent question was, anywhere there is social protection available to people, it can be probably used to adapt to a number of disruptions. Health insurance, for example. Health insurance in the country that I come from will spell the difference, particularly if you have 2 disruptions at once. Lose a job, lose your health. Lose your health, have a flood. Lose your health, have a flood, have an aging parent. Any combination of these things, some kind of contemporary protection, be it health protection, income protection, and on, will help you deal with disruptions. And so I think the way that we think about social protection, it's not siloed across areas like, well, this is health insurance, this is funeral insurance, this is for this area of my life, but really think about the human life cycle, potential disruptions in space and time, and how different kinds of safety nets, and there's tons of different kinds of tools, can help people achieve the objectives that they have in life. And also the last thing is, it's also a question of protection against what? The kinds of things that we struggle with today may not be the challenges that we face in the future. If you give someone today a bundle of clothing, they may need it. If you gave people a bundle of clothing 100 or 200 years ago, they would definitely have needed it, because today, in many, maybe even most parts of the world, we have such a different material situation.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Coco. This definitely brings us to this question of what needs to be protected. First is who needs to be protected, and then second, what needs to be protected. And I guess we would be exploring some of these questions in the future of social protection event on 22nd. Yeah, please check the schedule. I might be wrong. But yes, definitely we have an event there. We also have, just adding a bit to what you have said, we have case studies coming up on 23rd and 24th of September, where we would be showcasing some of the best practices looking at social protection as well as climate change on, again, 23rd and 24th of September. So please tune in for that. With this, I would like to go to the next question. Maybe have the questions again on the screen, please? Yeah. shall we go to question number 2, which I feel, question number 5. So it says, in the long run, who should be responsible for social protection in countries? Governments, NGOs, private sectors? I mean, yeah, I know one line in German for sure, es hängt von. So it's basically, it depends upon the context, if I may say. But a very quick take on that, maybe from Thomas, you and Zonke?
Well, very simple and a very clear answer. Of course, the government is responsible for its people, and they should be always play the central role. You should never give this away. Just think of water as a public good, give it to the private sector, and you create a lot of problems. So it should always be in the hands of a country leader who is responsible for all his people.
Well, I mean, you answered it already. I think it's context specific, and some of the context actually are also is also failed government and governance, and there I think we also should discuss what it means for the concept of social protection and climate change and climate disasters. One thing I wanted to say, because we are talking about different responsibility levels and actors, and I also wanted to say, following up from the concept of kind of when your own capacities are overwhelmed, a concept that Matthias introduced in the beginning, the international community definitely also has a role to play. And I think we should be very specific about it. And also in the context of climate change and climate disasters, this is very much the case. So it wasn't mentioned as one of the actors in the question, but I just wanted to highlight that in the discussions. We probably didn't nail that one, but I want to highlight it. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. I guess if I can again add to this particular question and advertise for another event on 21st of September, there we specifically look at the role of non-state actors. We would be looking throughout all these events, role of state actors, the government's apparatus and so on. But yes, definitely the role of non-state actors, especially the private parties, civil society. And this whole question of being addressing the questions that are emerging out. I think in the very beginning, we heard about the youth movements that are emerging. How do we make sure that we are in touch with the reality, and how do we ensure that everyone comes along? With this, we go to one more question. Can we have the questions again on the screen, please? Yeah. Matthias, we have a question specifically for you that also sort of relates to our concluding segment. So the question is, who do you think are the most vulnerable actors? So I add my own question to this, that who needs to be protected, just paraphrasing it. So Matthias, maybe we start from you, and anything else you would like to add in terms of tone setting for the event. Where do you see what needs to be explored? Again, if we have missed something from social as the interchange between social protection and climate change, if you want to add something there, we definitely look forward, and then we will try to explore them over the next 3 weeks.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, maybe an entry point to that question is actually tone setting, but it's a very personal viewpoint. I think increasingly, I'm not that old yet, even though I look quite old, but I've been working in this space for a couple of years now, and increasingly I actually lean back towards the position of saying science cannot provide all the answers. So the normative question of what needs to be done, who needs to be seen as the most vulnerable, I'm increasingly saying science can tell you how to assess along different metrics, how to compare different yardsticks of vulnerability and so forth. But at the end of the day, a society has to develop a good understanding, ideally a joint understanding of who they think are the people that need particular care, need particular assistance, need particular support. We see this in Germany, for instance, currently, without talking about other contexts now, but you know, if you're preparing for COVID vaccinations, who should actually be the first people to get it from a personal, ethical point of view, who need the most care, and from a systemic point of view, who are actually those that need it from a systemic point of view. And I think science can play a certain role in that, but it's not the only voice that should count. And this is, you will be hearing that from me a lot of times over the next two weeks, where I say we are one voice in a governance debate. We are not the only voice. And so I think different countries have actually come around, for instance, if you think about public social protection schemes, and actually have defined quite well, how do we think where do we draw the line between somebody who's eligible for special assistance, for example, who's maybe most vulnerable, and who is not? And many, many times, because we talked about poverty, starting from one of the very first sentences in Xiaomeng's keynote to a lot of comments. And I think poverty is an important player there, because in our modern world, money can buy you a lot of services, be it healthcare, be it a pension fund or whatsoever, also in the social protection scheme, but it's by far not the only thing that counts here. And for example, health predispositions relate to money, but they're not exclusive. And so I think it depends very much on the context to say who are my most vulnerable groups. Just maybe a quick appetizer, and then I really shut up. For the on the 23rd, we'll be looking a little bit into different components of social protection that I think relates to some of the earlier questions. It's quite interesting to see. I don't like to talk about governments so much, but about states. How have states actually defined for themselves what their contribution to social protection is or is not? And there is, if you look into the typical definitions of social protection, there's different elements, and the two most important ones maybe being social assistance and social insurance. And the two are very different. If you think about empowerment, actually, are you reliant on assistance, somebody coming in and giving you, or do you have an entitled right in a social insurance scheme because you're contributing to a scheme? So we'll be talking about these differences, and I think the normative visions around who should be empowered and which have entitlement to certain social protection services very much relates to that. And there I can tell you, and I'll talk about global patterns and what we see in the data, different states and different countries, different societies, in other words, have found very different ways forward of dealing with that. Some are very strong on the social insurance side. Some say we take social insurance, we keep it at a minimum, but whenever there is a crisis, we come in with assistance. And both have pros and cons, and they're talking about the mixture. It's quite interesting. And again, not just from an effectiveness point of view, but from the ethical point of view, what's actually your underlying understanding of empowerment of the most vulnerable? Are the most vulnerable some people who you hand down something in terms of assistance, or are there people who are entitled to something? And the two can be very different things on the gratitude or an entitlement of something. And so we'll be talking about that a little bit, I think, in various sessions, but also on the 23rd.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Matthias. In fact, I wanted to talk about the session on 23rd, as well as the session we have on 21st on non-state actors. So yes, definitely tune in. We also have some of the case studies, like you have mentioned, coming on 23rd and 24th. So definitely join in for those. Now, to rush very quickly, Coco, I wanted to come to you, but I won't, because I saw a question on loss and damage. And I don't know if you would like to address that in your concluding remarks, but maybe Aparna, we go to you very quickly. From your point of view, from the work that you have done, who needs to be protected?
It's a great question. And I think I want to loop this into a question, an additional question that's been raised by Zahra, one of the attendees, around informality, lack of ID cards, and how certain groups are frequently falling through the social protection net, being women or elderly. Yeah, and so I think it's folks that are falling through the gaps, that maybe don't have formal IDs. Looking at migrants, the refugees, there's kind of a whole range, I think, of folks that we need to be looking at. And I'm curious, and maybe Matthias and other folks that can provide a more scientific lens of how to be systematic in ensuring that these systems that are developed around social protection are actually indeed inclusive. Because I think the answer to that question is quite a long list, to be honest.
Definitely, that's something we would see, that first, who decides that list? So who needs to be protected? What needs to be protected? So these are the questions we would explore for sure. Zunke, if we come to you, again, the same question, but looking from the MCI's perspective, especially, I also wanted to ask you about the Caribbean insurance scheme that you talked. What has been your experience, if we tweak the question a bit? If we already have a bit of experience in terms of climate insurance and looking slightly from the social protection angle, that some people or certain groups have been more vocal or more active or more covered?
Yeah, I mean, climate risk insurance in itself is a relatively new concept. So maybe the implementation experience has been around, say, 10 years, 15 years with the early pilots. Some of it actually happened very much from a product perspective. Actually, our Caribbean work also started off from a product perspective. I think this is the right approach to also test out and look for innovation. And we also didn't talk about innovation. I think this is also a very important topic to have in order to close down the protection gap to some extent. But in any case, so the experience very much was coming from a product perspective, and I think in doing this type of work, I think the realization was that it actually needs to be a more comprehensive package, or needs to be part of a more comprehensive package. Needs also probably be part of a social protection approach, not replace one. I think that's very important. Not replace the social protection, but kind of add to it. And I think that this has been the experience by and large. If you go to some of the conferences, and if you listen to important peers in the debate, you would also see that many more, they actually open up to the kind of social protection discourse and are actively trying out. That said, there are also new experiences that actually explore that. I know, for example, Morocco is exploring a new mechanism linking social protection with what's called natural disasters. We don't like that word in our community, but this is how the insurance companies are terming it, with a natural disaster pool. And to have these kind of PPP arrangements where the private sector has a very specific role on on providing capacities, maybe also having this interlinkage to the kind of loss adjustment process, and it also comes down if you're talking about rights, for example, if you have an insurance, if you're paying for an insurance premium, you have an insurance contract, you also have a right in an insured case. So in loss adjustment, the private sector can also play a role. But at the same time, it's actually anchored in kind of a broader government scheme. It also looks into how to protect the most vulnerable, those that cannot pay for it. And I would agree with Matthias. I would, however, also say it is codified in some of the frameworks. The question on who are actually the people that need this kind of government protection, it is codified in international frameworks. It's often also codified in kind of national laws. And also many of the countries actually signed up to the international framework. So I would say there is a consensus to start, but it is also context specific. But yeah, all of this needs to come together, and I think there are also emerging examples of how to make that happen. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Zonke. We would definitely follow up on some of the points that you have raised. We go quickly to Thomas, and then Coco, we come to you towards the end. Would that be all right? Perfect.
Yeah, thank you, Himanshu, for this very simple question. Who? Of course, everybody needs protection. And then we must take a second look into who is resilient, who needs less assistance. And Aparna, thank you for mentioning the elderly people, the disabled. We need to look at people we often forget, and which governments also often forget because maybe of political things. And then we must look down, and then we early arrive at the vulnerable poor, the poorest of the poor, who we need to help out of poverty. So we must take a close look to grassroots level. And this is where, because we had the NGOs in our questions here from the attendees, there we need also the NGOs to tell us, to put the magnifying glass to grassroots level and to tell us, don't forget about these people, these marginalized peoples out there in the woods or whatsoever. So everybody need to be looked at, and then with the resilience analysis trickle down to grassroots level.
Thank you so much, Thomas. That was definitely very, very comprehensive in terms of what needs to be done. With this, now comes back to the policy question and the perspective. Coco, coming to you. And yeah, I don't know if you would like to still address the loss and damage question altogether in 1 minute.
Thank you. Joy and Sianti, I noticed that you posed two questions to me, and they're great questions. Maybe a way to kind of round things off. So Joy, you asked about loss and damage, and Sianti, you asked about long-term adaptation and where social protection fits in. So first to you, Joy, the quote that I put up, that third slide, will be made available. That's actually the kind of first part of the loss and damage decision from COP23. And as you remember, the framing is countries are really concerned about adverse impacts of climate change. Risk management has a role to play, of which social protection is a way to help avert, minimize, and address these adverse impacts of climate change. So social protection fits in. The XCOM, the Warsaw International Mechanisms Executive Committee, is working on that. Love to talk to you more about that, but social protection does fit into the work that we're doing. Now, Sianti, you asked about long-term adaptation, and we may see things similarly. Social protection maybe is a long-term tool. If you look at some of the social protection tools, and again, I think we probably see it very similarly, social protection helps humans in their short lifespans manage a whole range of variabilities from birth all the way through to death. I'd like to maybe point out a chapter from the fifth assessment report, chapter 16, looked at the adverse or just adaptation. What happens in the future? What options do we have? What are the opportunities and barriers? We are being drawn into the future through all of the disruptions that we're feeling right now. We have to get prepared. And as a society, some of the changes that have already been set in motion are not reversible in human timescale, at least. Social protection is one of the set of tools that we have to help us navigate that. How do we want the future to look? How do we want to live? How do we want to meet basic human needs? Ethics and norms will play a huge role. But I think that's really the frontier. That's where we need to focus, because it is those frontiers of resilience that you as an expert community are going to help define in the policy space and in practice, as well as, of course, in science.
Thank you so much, Coco, and thanks a lot, everyone. These questions are just marvelous and at the same very deep. They need a lot of answers and they need a lot more collective thinking. This is something we are going to do over next weeks. Please tune in. We are really sorry we could not address almost most of the questions, but we definitely have taken a note of it. It helps us in defining our next course of action. We would try to incorporate them as we progress along that path. We will make this event available. It is being live streamed on Facebook and would be available afterwards as well. So with this, thanks a lot to all our panelists. Special thank to Matthias and Aparna from joining digitally, and more than anyone, thanks to all of you who have joined us today, despite being in different time zones, and some of you, despite being like 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning. Thanks a lot for that, and we look forward to seeing you again next week, 15th of September. Have a nice day, have a nice evening, and a good morning.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.